Welcome, gentle listener, to a quiet journey through time. Tonight we travel to a small settlement called Meadowbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of colonial Massachusetts. As you settle into your evening rest, let your mind wander to this distant place and time, where ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances that would forever change their understanding of justice, community, and human nature. The year was 1692, and winter had been particularly harsh in Meadowbrook village. Snow lay heavy on the thatched roofs of modest homes, and chimney smoke curled lazily into the gray sky. The settlement was home to perhaps 300 souls, mostly farming families who had carved their lives from the wilderness with determination. And faith. In the modest parsonage at the heart of the village lived Reverend Thomas Whitmore, a man of middle years with graying temples and kind but weary eyes. His household included his young daughter, 9-year-old Catherine, and his orphan niece, 11-year-old Mary, whom he had taken in after her parents perished in an Indian raid 2 winters prior. The Whitmore home was a place of quiet, routine, and careful observation of religious duties. Each morning began with prayers, each meal with gratitude, each evening with scripture reading by the flickering light of tallow candles. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, currents of tension had been building for months. Catherine and Mary had grown, increasingly restless as the long winter confined them indoors. Like many young people of their time, they had begun to explore the mysteries that adults seemed reluctant to discuss. In the kitchen, they had befriended Esperanza, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean islands whom Reverend Whitmore had acquired to help with household duties. Esperanza brought with her knowledge of herbs, healing practices, and folk traditions from her homeland. During the longest nights of winter, when the wind howled through the bare branches and sleep came slowly, Esperanza would tell the girls stories of her distant home. She spoke of plants that could heal or harm, of ways to glimpse the future, and of the thin places where the spiritual world touched the physical realm. The girls, hungry for mystery and adventure in their carefully ordered lives, began to experiment with some of Esperanza's gentle divination practices. They would drop egg whites into bowls of water, hoping to see shapes that might reveal their future husbands. They collected certain herbs and flowers, arranging them in patterns that Esperanza had taught them. These activities seemed harmless enough, little different from the weather signs and folk remedies that every colonial household relied upon. But in the depths of February, something shifted. Catherine began experiencing strange episodes where she would fall to the ground, her body rigid, her eyes rolled back until only white showed. Mary soon followed, crying out that invisible hands were pinching and striking her. The episodes came without warning and left the girls exhausted and frightened. Reverend Whitmore called for Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, the village's learned physician. Dr. Hartwell examined the girls carefully, checking their humors, observing their symptoms, and consulting his medical texts. After much deliberation, he delivered his diagnosis with grave solemnity. The girls, he declared, were suffering from supernatural afflictions that lay beyond the realm of natural medicine. The news spread through Meadowbrook like ripples across a still pond. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups, whispering about the mysterious illness that had struck the minister's household. Some remembered similar cases from the old country, where such afflictions were attributed to malevolent supernatural forces. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the episodes continued and even intensified. The girls would cry out during their fits, claiming to see specters tormenting them. They spoke of invisible creatures pulling their hair, of phantom voices commanding them to sign mysterious books, of being transported through the air to strange gatherings in the forest. The first accusations came hesitantly, almost apologetically. When pressed by concerned adults about who might be causing their torment, the girls named 3 women: Esperanza, who had taught them the folk practices; Sarah Miller, the elderly widow who lived alone on the outskirts of town and was known for her sharp tongue and bitter disposition; and Margaret Oswald, an aging spinster who had scandalized the community years earlier by living openly with a man before their eventual marriage. These three women represented the margins of Meadowbrook society. Esperanza was enslaved and foreign, with knowledge that many found unsettling. Sarah Miller was poor and friendless, dependent on charity, and often resentful of those who turned her away. Margaret Oswald had violated social conventions and remained an object of whispered disapproval despite years of respectable behavior since her marriage. The accusations sent shockwaves through the small community. Here were three women, each vulnerable in her own way, suddenly charged with the most serious crime imaginable in Puritan society. The magistrates, Jeremiah Thornton and Cornelius Blackwood, were summoned from the county seat to conduct examinations. The examination process took place in a village meeting house, with most of the community in attendance. It was unlike any legal proceeding Meadowbrook had ever witnessed. Instead of focusing on evidence and witnesses in the traditional sense, the magistrates seemed most interested in the theatrical displays of the afflicted girls. Catherine and Mary would enter the meeting house apparently healthy, but the moment they laid eyes on one of the accused, they would fall into violent fits. They would scream that the woman's specter was tormenting them, describe in vivid detail the invisible attacks they were experiencing, and beg for protection from their supernatural tormentors. The magistrates treated these displays as compelling evidence of supernatural crime. They questioned the accused not about their actual activities or whereabouts, but about their involvement in an invisible world of spirits and devils. The burden of proof had shifted dramatically. Instead of requiring evidence that a crime had been committed, the court seemed to assume guilt and demand that the accused prove their innocence of supernatural charges that were, by their very nature, impossible to disprove. Esperanza, understanding that her life hung in the balance, chose to tell her interrogators what they seemed to want to hear. Yes, she confessed, she had indeed practiced supernatural arts. She wove elaborate tales of midnight gatherings in the forest, of signing her name in a mysterious book, of being commanded by shadowy figures to harm the children. Her confession was detailed and compelling, filled with exactly the kind of diabolic conspiracy that the magistrates expected to uncover. But Esperanza's confession came with a price. She was pressed to name other participants in these supernatural activities. Under intense questioning, she began to implicate additional members of the community, describing how various neighbors had appeared at the midnight gatherings or had been present when supernatural crimes were planned. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller and Margaret Oswald maintained their innocence with increasing desperation. They pointed out the logical impossibilities in the accusations against them. They called upon their neighbors to vouch for their character. They demonstrated their knowledge of Scripture and their faithfulness to religious duties. But their protests seemed only to inflame the situation further. The magistrates interpreted their denials as evidence of stubborn defiance, their emotional distress as proof of guilty conscience. As spring progressed into summer, the circle of accusations began to widen. Each person implicated by previous confessions faced the same terrible choice: maintain innocence and risk execution, or confess and implicate others to purchase temporary safety. Some chose confession and found themselves drawn deeper into a web of false testimony. Others insisted on their innocence and watched in horror as their protests were twisted into evidence of supernatural obstinacy. The hot case of Hannah Cooper illustrates the impossible position facing the accused. Hannah was a respected member of the community, known for her charitable works and her devotion to her family. She had raised 7 children, nursed countless neighbors through illness, and never given cause for complaint or suspicion. When Hannah was accused, based on testimony from earlier confessors who claimed to have seen her at supernatural gatherings, the community was shocked. Here was a woman whose entire life had been an example of Christian virtue, suddenly charged with the most heinous spiritual crimes. During her examination, Hannah faced a nightmare of circular logic. When she denied the charges, Magistrate Thornton demanded to know why the afflicted girls were suffering if she was innocent. When she suggested they might be mistaken or influenced by others, she was accused of calling God's chosen witnesses liars. When she requested time to pray before answering questions, this was interpreted as an attempt to consult with evil spirits. The afflicted girls performed their usual theatrical displays during Hannah's examination, writhing and screaming that her specter was attacking them even as she stood quietly in the dock. The assembled community watched in fascination and horror as their neighbor was transformed from a beloved member of their society into an alleged servant of darkness. Hannah's husband, Robert Cooper, faced an agonizing dilemma. Standing by his wife risked bringing suspicion upon himself and their children. Abandoning her might save the family, but would destroy their life together. In the end, pressure from neighbors and fear for his children's safety led Robert to distance himself from Hannah's defense, a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The examinations revealed a disturbing pattern in how accusations spread through the community. They often followed lines of existing tension and conflict. Neighbors who had disputed over property lines found themselves on opposite sides of supernatural charges. Families involved in inheritance disputes discovered that their legal opponents had suddenly become spiritual enemies. Business rivals learned that commercial competition could be reframed as business, evidence of diabolic interference. The Hartwell and Blackwood families had been feuding for 2 generations over water rights to a valuable mill stream. When young Catherine claimed to see the specter of Ruth Hartwell at one of her tormenting sessions, it seemed to many that this long-standing earthly dispute had finally revealed its supernatural dimensions. The fact that Ruth Hartwell had recently won a crucial court case against the Blackwoods only seemed to confirm that supernatural forces had been at work all along. As the summer wore on, the legal proceedings took on an increasingly frantic pace. A special court was established with Judge William Harrison presiding, a man known for his stern interpretation of the law and his unwavering belief in the reality of supernatural crime. Judge Harrison had gained his reputation in other colonies, where he had presided over similar cases and earned praise for his vigorous prosecution of spiritual offenses. The court that emerged under Judge Harrison's direction abandoned many of the traditional protections that English law had developed over centuries. The accused were denied the right to legal representation, the right to cross-examine their accusers, and the right to call character witnesses. Instead, they faced a system designed to validate the accusations against them and extract confessions that could be used to implicate others. The first execution took place on a warm June morning. Eleanor Bishop, a tavern keeper known for her colorful dress and independent spirit, was hanged after maintaining her innocence to the very end. The community gathered to witness what they were told was justice being served against spiritual evil, but many left feeling unsettled by what they had seen. Eleanor Bishop had lived differently than most women in Meadowbrook. She had inherited her tavern from her first husband, expanded the business through her own efforts, and married again for love rather than financial necessity. Her establishment was a gathering place for travelers and local men, a role that brought her into contact with ideas and behaviors that more convention of women avoided. When accusations first surfaced against Eleanor, they focused on her nonconformist lifestyle. Witnesses testified that she had been seen talking to strange animals, that drinks served at her tavern had unusual effects, and that travelers who stayed there sometimes reported disturbing dreams. None of this constituted evidence of actual supernatural activity, but in the fevered atmosphere of Meadowbrook, such testimony was treated as compelling proof of diabolic involvement. Eleanor's execution was followed by others as the summer progressed. Each hanging was presented as a victory over supernatural evil, a necessary step in protecting the community from spiritual contamination. But rather than bringing peace to Meadowbrook, the executions seemed to intensify the atmosphere of suspicion and fear. The case of Samuel Fletcher demonstrates how the accusations could destroy even the most respected members of the community. Samuel was a former minister who had served Meadowbrook faithfully for 15 years before stepping down due to advancing age. He was known throughout the region for his learning, his gentle pastoral care, and his ability to heal divisions within the congregation. When Samuel was accused of being the leader of the supernatural conspiracy, the charge seemed so preposterous that many initially dismissed it as impossible. But the accusers had learned to craft their testimonies with increasing sophistication. They claimed that Samuel's very reputation for goodness was evidence of his supernatural cunning, that his knowledge of Scripture allowed him to hide his true nature, and that his influence over the community had been achieved through spiritual manipulation rather than genuine virtue. During his trial, Samuel's accusers painted a picture of midnight gatherings where he had presided over diabolic ceremonies, of supernatural attacks he had orchestrated against faithful members of the congregation, and of a conspiracy that reached into every corner of community life. The testimony was elaborate and detailed, but it was also entirely fabricated, the product of coached witnesses and leading questions from magistrates who had already decided on his guilt. Samuel faced his accusers with dignity and patience, answering their questions with careful attention to truth and refusing to be provoked into anger or despair. When asked to confess his supernatural crimes, he replied that he could not admit to actions he had not taken, even if confession might save his life. When pressed to name other participants in the alleged conspiracy, he responded that he could not identify accomplices in activities that existed only in the imagination of his accusers. The community watched in fascination and horror as this beloved figure was systematically destroyed by the legal process. Some began to whisper doubts about the proceedings, but expressing such skepticism had become dangerous. Several individuals who had questioned the accusations found themselves facing charges of their own, accused of attempting to protect the supernatural conspiracy by undermining the court's work. Samuel Fletcher was executed on a humid afternoon in late July. As he stood on the scaffold, he was given one final opportunity to confess his sins and save his soul. Instead, he used his last moments to forgive his accusers, to pray for the community that was destroying him, and to maintain his innocence before God and man. His death marked a turning point for many in Meadowbrook, as the execution of such an obviously innocent man made the fundamental injustice of the proceedings impossible to ignore. The psychological toll of the trials extended far beyond those directly accused. Families were torn apart as relatives turned against each other out of fear or genuine belief. Children were encouraged to report suspicious behavior by their own parents. Spouses found themselves wondering if their partners might be hiding supernatural secrets. The basic trust that holds communities together was systematically destroyed by suspicion and paranoia. The case of the Whitmore family illustrates this broader destruction of social bonds. As the original accusers, Catherine and Mary found themselves at the center of ever-increasing attention and responsibility. They were consulted about new accusations, asked to identify supernatural culprits, and treated as experts on spiritual matters that would have been considered far beyond their understanding in normal times. The psychological pressure on the girls was immense. They had begun with what might have been innocent experimentation or genuine illness, but they now found themselves trapped in roles that demanded increasingly elaborate performances. Each new accusation had to be supported with detailed testimony. Each court appearance required convincing displays of supernatural torment. The girls discovered that backing down or admitting error would likely result in accusations being turned against them. Catherine began showing signs of the strain as summer progressed. She became withdrawn and anxious, sometimes contradicting her earlier testimony or expressing confusion about events she had previously described in vivid detail. When concerned adults questioned these inconsistencies, they were told that supernatural forces were attempting to confuse the girl or make her doubt her own experiences. Mary, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the attention and authority her role provided. She became increasingly dramatic in her accusations, providing ever more elaborate descriptions of supernatural encounters, and claiming to see specters of numerous community members engaged in diabolic activities. Her testimony became central to many prosecutions, and she seemed to relish her position as a key witness in the battle between good and evil. The economic impact of the trials was severe and far-reaching. When individuals were accused, their property was often seized to pay for their imprisonment and legal proceedings. Families could be ruined overnight, not only losing their primary earners, but also facing financial obligations they could never hope to meet. Some fled Meadowbrook entirely, abandoning homes and businesses rather than risk accusation. The case of merchant Thomas Sterling illustrates these economic dynamics. Thomas had built a successful trading operation, importing goods from Boston and New York for sale throughout the region. His prosperity had made him envious in some quarters, particularly among competitors who struggled to match his success. When Thomas was accused of achieving his wealth through supernatural means, the charges seemed to provide a convenient explanation for his success while offering his rivals an opportunity to eliminate their most effective competitor. Testimony suggested that Thomas had made diabolic bargains to ensure profitable trade deals, that his ships had been protected from storms through supernatural intervention, and that his customers had been supernaturally compelled to purchase his goods. Within days of his accusation, Thomas's assets were frozen and his business operations ground to a halt. Even if he had ultimately been acquitted, the damage to his reputation and finances would have been catastrophic. As it happened, Thomas chose to flee Meadowbrook with his family, abandoning his property and starting over in a distant colony where the supernatural hysteria had not taken hold. Flight of families like the Sterlings had a cumulative effect on Meadowbrook's economy and social structure. The community lost many of its most productive and innovative members, while those who remained lived in constant fear that success or prosperity might itself become evidence of supernatural wrongdoing. Trade declined, agricultural production suffered, and the general atmosphere of suspicion made cooperative endeavors increasingly difficult as autumn approached. The trials began to consume individuals who had previously seen beyond suspicion. The accusations reached into established families, respected professions, and even the edges of the colonial government itself. When the wife of a prominent magistrate from the county seat was accused based on spectral evidence, the response was swift and decisive. Suddenly, the same type of evidence that had sent dozens to their deaths was declared unreliable and insufficient for prosecution. The same magistrates who had accepted testimony about supernatural attacks and diabolic conspiracies now insisted on higher standards of proof and greater attention to legal procedures. The same community leaders who had supported the trials as necessary spiritual warfare now expressed concerns about their methods and outcomes. The end came not through any sudden outbreak of reason or compassion, but through the recognition that the accusations had finally reached individuals too powerful and well-connected to be safely destroyed. Governor Philip Hamilton ordered the dissolution of the special court and the release of those still awaiting trial. The supernatural hysteria that had gripped Meadowbrook for months came to an abrupt end. In the aftermath, the community struggled to make sense of what had occurred. 24 people had been executed, including individuals who had been pillars of the community just months earlier. Hundreds more had been accused, imprisoned, or forced to flee. Families were broken, friendships destroyed, and the basic social fabric of Meadowbrook left in tatters. Some participants in the trials expressed remorse for their roles in the proceedings. Judge Harrison eventually acknowledged that errors had been made, though he maintained that the court had acted with good intentions in difficult circumstances. Several jurors who had voted for convictions later signed statements expressing their regret and asking forgiveness from the families of those they had condemned. The afflicted girls faced varying fates in the years following the trials. Catherine Whitmore, the youngest of the original accusers, seemed to recover gradually from her episodes and lived a quiet life, marrying a farmer from a neighboring town and raising a family away from the scene of the trials. She rarely spoke of her experiences and appeared to carry the burden of what had occurred with deep sorrow. Mary Whitmore continued to claim supernatural abilities for several years after the trials ended, but she found fewer people willing to listen to her accusations. Eventually, she married and moved to a frontier settlement where her past was unknown. In later years, she provided one of the few public apologies from the accusers, acknowledging that she had been deluded by supernatural forces and asking forgiveness from those she had harmed. ESP-ERANZA, whose initial confession had helped launch the crisis, was released from prison after the court was dissolved. She lived quietly in Reverend Whitmore's household for several more years before gaining her freedom and disappearing from historical records. Her ultimate fate remains unknown, but she left behind a complex legacy as both victim and participant in the tragedy that consumed her community. The families of those executed faced years of struggle to restore their reputations and recover their property. Some succeeded in rebuilding their lives and reclaiming their places in the community. Others remained forever marked by the accusations against their loved ones, carrying the stigma of supernatural association for generations. Hannah Cooper's husband, Robert, spent the remainder of his life attempting to make amends for abandoning his wife during her trial. He petitioned unsuccessfully for her official exoneration, maintained her innocence to all who would listen, and provided support to other families affected by the trials. His efforts to repair the damage done to his family and community became a form of penance that consumed his remaining years. The physical reminders of the trials gradually faded from Meadowbrook. The special courthouse where so many had been condemned returned to its normal function as a meeting house. The jail where hundreds had suffered during their imprisonment continued to hold common criminals. The gallows where 24 had died was dismantled, though the hill where it stood retained an aura of sorrow that lasted for generations. More difficult to erase were the psychological and social scars left by the trials. Trust between neighbors took decades to rebuild. Many families left Meadowbrook entirely, seeking fresh starts in communities untainted by supernatural hysteria. Those who remained lived with the knowledge of what they had witnessed and, in many cases, participated in during those terrible months of 1692. The trials left a complex legacy for Meadowbrook and the broader region. On one hand, they served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning rational inquiry and legal protections in times of crisis. The speed with which a peaceful community had descended into persecution and judicial murder provided sobering lessons about human nature and social dynamics. On the other hand, the eventual end of the trials and the expressions of remorse from some participants offered hope that communities could learn from their mistakes and rebuild on stronger foundations. The gradual acknowledgement that innocent people had died unjustly helped establish important precedents about the rights of the accused and the standards of evidence required in criminal proceedings. Scholars and ministers in the years following the trials engaged in extensive analysis of what had gone wrong in Meadowbrook. Some focused on theological questions about the nature of spiritual evidence and the proper relationship between secular and supernatural concerns. Others examined legal issues about due process, standards of proof, and the protection of individual rights within community systems of justice. Perhaps most importantly, the trials forced difficult conversations about the nature of authority and the dangers of mass hysteria. The ease with which respected leaders had abandoned their principles, ordinary citizens had turned against their neighbors, and an entire community had convinced itself that murder was necessary for spiritual protection, raised troubling questions about the stability of civilized society. These conversations contributed to broader developments in colonial American thought about individual rights, community responsibility, and the proper limits of government power. The lessons learned from Meadowbrook's tragedy helped inform later discussions about constitutional protections, judicial procedures, and the separation of powers that would become central to American political development. The story of the Meadowbrook trials also illustrates broader patterns of social conflict and community breakdown that have appeared throughout history. The targeting of vulnerable populations, the use of fear to justify extreme measures, the abandonment of established legal protections, and the transformation of neighbors into enemies are dynamics that extend far beyond the specific context of 17th century New England. Understanding these patterns can help us recognize similar processes when they emerge in different times and places. The psychological mechanisms that drove the accusations in Meadowbrook, the need for explanations in times of uncertainty, the appeal of simple answers to complex problems, the power of group conformity, and the tendency to scapegoat outsiders, remain relevant to contemporary social and political dynamics. As we reflect on the tragedy that befell this small colonial community, we are reminded of both the fragility and the resilience of human societies. The same people capable of such cruelty and irrationality were also capable of eventual recognition of their errors and efforts to make amends. The community that descended into persecution and murder also possessed the capacity for learning, growth, and moral development. The survivors of the Meadowbrook trials carried forward both the trauma of their experiences and the wisdom gained through suffering. Their stories became part of the collective memory that helped shape American approaches to justice, individual rights, and community responsibility. Their pain served a larger purpose in the development of legal and social institutions designed to prevent similar tragedies. In our modern world, we face different challenges and different temptations, but the fundamental lessons of Meadowbrook remain relevant. The need for careful attention to evidence, protection of individual rights, skepticism toward mass hysteria, and courage to speak truth in difficult circumstances are as important today as they were 3 centuries ago. The story of Catherine and Mary, of Hannah Cooper and Samuel Fletcher, of all those who suffered and died during those terrible months, serves as both warning and inspiration. Their experiences remind us of our capacity for both evil and good, our vulnerability to fear and our potential for courage, our tendency toward conformity, and our capability for independent moral judgment. As we conclude this gentle journey through a dark chapter of our shared past, let us remember that history is not merely a collection of facts and dates, but a repository of human experience that can inform our present choices and future possibilities. The people of Meadowbrook were not fundamentally different from ourselves. They faced fears and uncertainties, made difficult decisions under pressure, and struggled to distinguish truth from falsehood in confusing circumstances. Their failures remind us of the importance of maintaining our commitment to justice, compassion, and rational inquiry, even when such commitments are difficult and unpopular. Their eventual recognition of error and expressions of remorse offer hope that human societies can learn, grow, and build better institutions based on painful experience. The quiet hills of Massachusetts, where Meadowbrook once stood, now sheltered different communities facing different challenges. But the lessons learned through the suffering of those long-ago residents continue to echo through time, reminding each generation of both the dangers we must guard against and the possibilities we might achieve when we choose wisdom over fear, compassion over cruelty, and truth over convenience. Rest now, gentle listener, with these reflections upon the complexity of human nature and the enduring importance of justice and compassion in our shared life together. May the peaceful sleep that comes with evening bring renewal for tomorrow's challenges and wisdom for the choices that await us all. The story of Meadowbrook reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we retain the capacity for redemption and the possibility of building something better from the ruins of our mistakes. In this hope, we find both comfort for the present and courage for whatever test the future may bring. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with visions of communities built on justice, compassion, and mutual understanding, where the tragedies of the past serve as foundations for a more enlightened and humane future.